Welcome to Chapter 14, Part 5. We're going to be talking about foreign affairs and foreign interventions, as well as the end of slavery. The South uses cotton as a manipulation tool in the war to entice Britain or France to give direct aid to the South. Remember, that was their livelihood down there, and if they could sell cotton, then they could make money. If they make money, they can support the war efforts. If they can support the war efforts, well, they might have a chance of winning the war. South's tactic was to head up north, cross into enemy territories, claim a victory. If they could claim a victory there, then perhaps the North might recognize their sovereignty as a nation, the Confederate States of America. Well, Britain and much of Europe at the time depended on South's cotton, as there were several textile mills, and the wealthy aristocracy stood by with a smile on their face in watching the great American experiment go up in flames. In fact, there were numerous bets to see how long we even last as a country. And that's why I have a picture of the Grinch who kind of looks at us smugly right now and knowing that this great American experiment is going to dissolve. We have Queen Elizabeth and her son Charles down there who are looking at us, laughing at us. Well, I suppose we had the last laugh because we came out victorious in this whole thing as a nation, not necessarily the Union or the South, but just as a nation we came together. But I wonder how much longer it's going to be before America falls apart. And if it does fall apart, who would be there to pick up the pieces? Would it be Great Britain? Would it be China? Would it be Mexico? Would it be any number of places who might come and claim this land? The Trent Affair is a little known, talked about piece in history books. It was almost the First World War, if you want to imagine it that way. What happened was the South was going to send some diplomats over to Europe, predominantly in Ireland, France, Great Britain, seeking their support. Not only financial support, but support that they could buy ammunitions, ships, things of the nature. Well, they were traveling on a British steamer known as the Trent. The Union stopped the British in Cuban waters, seized the diplomats as prisoners of war. This did not please Britain because, number one, the British steamer was stopped in open waters. Number two, the Union confiscated property they thought, or they considered, of British. And so the British said, look, either give them back or you're going to pay for this. So it took a while for Lincoln to cave in, but he eventually did. But in the meantime, British started sending troops over to Canada, and they got prepared ready for war. So as the Union is preparing, or as the Union is looking at this, they're thinking, oh man, we got a war at the South. We have a war from the North. We can't win this. There's no way. We're stretched to limits now. Lincoln eventually gives in to the demands. But I wonder, and as you should too, how might history have been different if Lincoln didn't cave to British demands? What if Lincoln was so set in his ways that he said, no, we're not going to give those diplomats back, and you can do what you wish? And so we have a war from the North, from Canada. We have the war from the South. I wonder if we could have sustained that war, if we could have won that war. Well, Britain has another way of helping the South. If they can't be directly involved in the war efforts, then they'll be indirectly involved in the war efforts. So the Confederacy purchases warships from them. And Alabama was one of these raider ships. It would swoop in, sink the Union ships, and swoop right out of sight. That's why it was called a raider ship. And the Alabama was responsible for sinking up to 60-plus ships, mainly on the coast of the United States portion. Eventually sank off the coast of France. At the end of the war, Great Britain agrees to pay $15.5 million in damages caused by these raiders, which would be $2.6 billion today. There is something called the Laird Rams, which I'm not sure if it's talked about in your book or not, but it's a secret project by the British government two ships named the Scorpion and the Wyvern. This was in 1865. And so these were secret ships. If you can think of the old ironclads like the Merrimack and the Monitor ships, well, they're ironclad ships, but they also have rams on them. So if you're going up against a wooden ship and you ram into the ship, there's no chance that that Union ship would stand a chance. So this is a secret project. So down below, in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a drawing of this ship. 230 feet long, 40 feet wide, which, back then standards, that was huge. That's a huge ship. It's almost like the Titanic of the time, if you want to think about it that way. It's got 6 to 7 foot iron spears at the front of the ship, which will literally just pierce into the hull, allowing water to come in and sinks it goes. They have rotating turret batteries, which simply, in layman's terms, if you look in the lower left-hand corner here, if you can think of a tank that has a movable, left, right, up and down guns. Again, that's a huge game changer for this war. It has full iron plating and has a top speed of 10 knots, which for a warship at this time, and even for an iron ship at this time, that's pretty fast. These ships became the Union's worst nightmare. Lincoln's cabinet even considered blatantly ignoring Britain's neutrality and sending the U.S. Navy squadron to destroy these things, which had been under construction since 1864. The Scorpion was sunk at sea in 1903, and the Wyvern was sold as scrap in 1922. So these would have been two great big game changers. Again, they came into action in 1865, towards the end of the war. Had they been in action earlier on, they might have done some damage. However, you still have to deal with the land battles, not just the naval battles themselves. So as the end of the war is approaching, cotton used to be king, at least for the South, but now Britain and other places turn their eyes to Egypt and India's cotton. Why have to ship it all the way across the pond when I can get it relatively close, and perhaps even cheaper? Without the financial backing, the South is finished. There's no way they can win a war. Doesn't matter how much determination they have. Doesn't matter how much guns. Doesn't matter how much stuff they have. How many men they have. They're done. So, is this really the end of support from Britain? Will they finally leave us alone and let our experiment play out? Well, there are two things that come into play. Number one is General Lee's loss at Antietam, where he's forced to retreat back to the South. And two is the Union's objective of entering slavery appealed to the Britain's working class. Well, if Britain didn't like slavery, then why should they support slavery? So it didn't really fit their moniker of what their society was all about. So it was be kind of pointless, kind of silly to support the South at this point. Is this really the end of slavery, though? Lincoln's concerns came down to four things. Number one, keeping the support of the border states. Because remember, the border states held a large population. If that population swings to the South increases their population and could potentially turn the tides of the war. Number two, making sure there are constitutional protections of slavery. Number three, the racial prejudice of Northerners. Not all Northerners were opposed against slavery, or against slavery, excuse me. You still have people that secretly would like to see slavery happen. But we often think that, if you're in the North, you must like the black people and you are against slavery. If you're in the South, you must not like black people and you're for slavery. And that's not always the case, at least at the time. And number four, fear that all this could be overturned in the next election cycle. If you think about all the things that Donald Trump has accomplished in his 4 years, whether you like him as a president or not like him as a president, well, the next president that comes into office, Joe Biden, if that's who in fact does come into office for sure, he literally has the power to overturn some of the policies that Donald Trump has done. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it sure puts us on a pendulum where we swing back and forth one way. I mean, one year we don't have slavery, the next president says, yes, let's have slavery. And we keep going back and forth and back and forth. I mean, we could do some really big damage to this nation. We have something called the Confiscation Acts. Runaway slaves in the South would now become part of the contraband of the South. And in some cases, they were either forced to fight for the Confederacy, or they would be imprisoned, basically. In July 1862, the Second Confiscation Act came into play, which basically says anyone who was enslaved by anyone, regardless, fighting the Union's cause is now considered a free person. So if you're in Georgia and you were fighting against the Union as a slave, we now wave the wand and you're now considered a free person in the North. This also gave the U.S. President power to free slaves in the Union Army in any capacity, including battle. So even though they were free, you could still be drafted into the military and still be used as a soldier, black or white. And it gives rise to all black regiments that were fierce fighters. Can you imagine the anger and the hate that black people might have had towards the South? I mean, imagine you were a slave and you endured just utter hell during your time, during your parents' time, your grandparents' time, and you watch this all unfold. I can't imagine just the amount of hate that you might have. However, one might have forgiveness too. I don't really know. I really wish that we could sit down with a former free slave and talk to him about how they felt. And perhaps maybe if we were to take some time in YouTube and look, there might be some either transcripts or some recording of that happening if we took some time. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry. This was a Union regiment. It's all volunteer. And they were known as the fierce fighting warriors against the Confederates. It was the second all-black Union regiment to fight in the war, after the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment. It was led by a person by the name of Robert Shaw. I included 2 links in here. The first one is only about 3 minutes or so. I'd like you to watch that one, but if you really want to know more about this 54th Massachusetts Infantry and the role of black people, free black people in the Civil War, I encourage you to take a look at the documentary there. So this is a picture of the 54th Infantry. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a group of soldiers standing by, waiting for not sure what. Upper right-hand corner, led by Robert Shaw. Lower right-hand corner, this is just a blown-up version of the video above, or excuse me, the picture above. Just take a look at their faces and just kind of put yourself in their shoes for a minute and what do you think they're thinking? And this last bit I put here, this is sick. This is the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, or Regiment, excuse me. This is the monument dedicated to them. This was defaced, I believe, June of 2020, this year. And it was defaced by a Black Lives Matter movement. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the Black Lives Matter movement it doesn't mean anything at this point. But I wonder if the people who defaced that monument, if they actually knew what that monument was dedicated for and the lives that were lost in sacrifice to that monument. And I'll just leave it at that. The Emancipation Proclamation. Well, before we pass this, you have to win the support of the conservative Northerners. Conservatives, think of it as people who like to cling on to the old ways. To put it in more modern times, the way things used to be. Wives in the kitchen, husbands at work, being the breadwinner, kind of that thinking of conservatorship. And again, that's not what I believe. I'm just trying to give you an example here. Lincoln encouraged border states to come up with an emancipation and compensation plan to their owners. So this all had to play out before we just released the slaves. So this was actually a pretty well thought out idea. It wasn't just let the slaves go and poof, we're done. It unfolded actually. I would encourage you to take time to read the document above, the hyperlink there, which is the actual text to the Emancipation Proclamation speech. So here we have the introduction of the 13th Amendment, which states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Well, you have to think that these were written by lawmakers, and for the common man to understand that might have been a little difficult. And even if you were a slave, think about how difficult that would be to understand what this amendment exactly means. So, are the slaves really free? The truths that we don't know, the things that are not brought up in media and schools. I read an article not too long ago, arguments over the language of the amendment. And this person, scholarly person, says that the text allows for involuntary servitude where convicted of a crime. So, slavery in some form exists. The black codes were created new types of offenses which sent more black people to prison than ever before, and they were left defenseless even though they were free. So just by sheer disrespect of somebody, a black person could go to jail, and they had no recourse for their action or for their defense. There was nobody there to defend them at the time. And the last point is states put prisoners to work through a practice called convict leasing, whereby white planters and industrialists leased prisoners to work for them. States and private businesses made money doing this, but prisoners did not. This meant many black prisoners found themselves living and working on plantations against their will and for no pay decades after the Civil War. And to put this on top of this, the idea that, again, we said this before, but if you were a black person in the South as a slave, and you didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation, you didn't know about the 13th Amendment, you didn't know any of that kind of stuff, well, as long as you're kept in the dark, you were kept as a slave. It wasn't like the plantation owners would shout from the rooftops and go, "You're free!" No, because if he shouted that and the slaves left, well, how can he sustain his plantation? And I'm not sticking up for the plantation owner. That's the reality of it, is that if they lose their slaves, they lose their livelihoods. And the last slide for right now is post-Emancipation Proclamation. By January of 1863, a quarter of the slave population walked away from slavery and to seek protections in the North. And again, it's great to move to the North, but if you can get to Canada, you're even better. 200,000 plus minus African Americans would serve in the United States or the Union Army and Navy. And even though they served in the Navy and the Army, they were segregated. And 37,000 plus or minus African Americans died in what became known as the Army of Freedom. This concludes Chapter 14, Part 5.